Hey everybody, welcome back. We have another exciting conversation for you today. If you're listening, following us on CounterPunch, thank you so much. Go over to the website, get yourself a subscription to CounterPunch Plus. That is our subscriber section. All the exclusive content that previously would have appeared in our print magazine, our dearly departed print magazine, that's now available in CounterPunch Plus. In fact, there's even more than what used to be printed on paper. We have all of our regulars, of course, Jeffrey Sinclair's column every single week that a lot of people look forward to, and all of our guest contributors, our regular contributors. We have so many perspectives from the left, really from all over the world. That's really important from, well, in my opinion, that's very important. It's one of the few places on the left that can really say that. And at the same time, CounterPunch also has a reputation of trying to provide a platform and support for our friends and for those people who do good work that we like, that we want to support. And I have one of those with me today. He's a returning guest. I don't know if it's second or third time or fourth time, whatever it is, but Doug Greene is back with me. Doug, in my opinion, is one of the preeminent historians working today in the United States. He's written several books, all of which are critical, that I think you should get copies of. Go to, find him online and buy all of his books. But today we are talking about his brand new book. The book is called Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn, Anticommunism, Marxism, and the Fate of the Soviet Union. Here's this beautiful looking book that I would recommend you get yourself a copy of, and or reach out to your local library and demand that they order copies of Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn. Doug Greene, thank you for the book. Thank you for coming back to CounterPunch.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so happy to be here today.
We are big fans of your work. As always, this book really hits at a lot of important questions for those of us on the left. So I'm going to begin with probably the most basic of all questions, and it might be the question that dawns on everybody's mind when they look at the book. Doug, what does the title mean? What is the Dialectics of Saturn?
Well, I'm glad you asked, and to anyone reading the book, it is actually answered on the very first page of my introduction. But the title goes back to Greco-Roman mythology of the god Saturn eating his children. And this was a phrase uttered during the French Revolution by figures like Georges Danton, who was guillotined by the Jacobins, and conservatives who said the revolution is like Saturn, it will devour its children. And that's become almost a cliche among certain segments of moderates, conservatives, reactionaries, and social democrats, that revolutions promise new liberation, a world free of exploitation, but they end up with despotism, purges, and terror. And it was applied to the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution after it, since it promised this internationalism, a world ruled by the working class, and ended up with Stalinism and purges. And in many respects, it seemed like the same actors appeared in both cases. You have a Napoleon in France, and you have a Stalin in Russia, a Robespierre, and a Lenin. So it becomes for all these figures like that there's this pattern that's written into revolutions, into its genetic code. And the phrase itself was even used by the late Marxist academic Domenico Lacerda, who was actually defending Stalin, saying there's a dialectic of Saturn at work in the Russian Revolution. It's necessary. It leads us, the early utopianism of the revolution gives way to Stalin's realism, and that's a necessary process. And basically, I'm rejecting this idea because it's used by both the the right and the left. On the one hand, obviously, the right is using it to condemn revolution and changing the world. But people who come out of the official communist parties that were aligned with the Soviet Union, a lot of major figures in Western Marxism see Stalinism as like the only way to reach socialism and communism. And I'm using Marx's analysis from the 18th Brumaire, which is where he's looking at Napoleon III, who became emperor of France. And he's wondering, how did this mediocrity become the leader of the most powerful country in Europe? And he's saying Marx distinguishes his analysis from the three camps who have their own dialectic of Saturn. They argue that Napoleon is either like a bolt from the blue, he kind of appears out of nowhere like this demonic figure, or there's the people who defend Napoleon as an instrument of historical necessity. And Marx is saying, I reject those two as fatalistic, teleological, and I'm embracing, a materialist analysis based on the class struggle. which is what I'm trying to do and using Leon Trotsky's work to help make that point. But basically, I argue that the dialectic of Saturn is this kind of moralism, mysticism. It's false idea of historical necessity and fatalism, and it doesn't explain revolutions. It mystifies them, and it just and it really isn't based in reason and materialism.
I'm going to return to the Soviet question in a second, but since you mentioned the French Revolution, is the concept that you're sketching out, is that something that was contemporary with right-wing analysis of the French Revolution? I mean, Edmund Burke is obviously the most famous, but he's not the only one. Was this concept, maybe not called the Saturn or whatever, but was this idea present at the time?
Yes, it was. So you do mention Edmund Burke. The other person I would mention is Jacques Dupin. I think Jacques Mallat Dupin, who was a French conservative, and he actually in 1793, at the height of the terror, he does say the revolution is consuming its children, like Saturn. And obviously Georges Danton, who is a French revolutionary, used it, and this was dramatized in several plays afterward by George Buchner and a Polish playwright. So it was used at the time, and kind of has found its way into the vernacular. And you can see this in films like the 1980s film on Danton, etc.
Part of the reason I asked that question is because those of us who obsess about the Russian Revolution know that the French Revolution was the model. It was the historical parallel that all of the revolutionaries were studying and studying again and studying again and again and again, and trying to kind of map their experiences, map their politics as against the French Revolution, and understanding where they, fit into everything. And so the question I would have is then, were people like Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin, were they thinking about this same concept as they were making revolution?
Yes. So shortly, it actually goes all the way back to Engels and Marx, who are looking at Russia, and they're seeing almost a similar pattern, like this old decrepit monarchy, new rising classes, new intelligentsia, and they think, well, Russia's approaching its 1789 and 1793, and everyone on the Russian socialist left is basically wondering, who's going to play what role, who's going to be Robespierre, who's going to be Danton, who might be Napoleon. And it's Plekhanov, it's Lenin, it's Trotsky, it's Martov, all of them. And at times Lenin says, we want a party of Jacobins. Now, they don't want it like in the literal way, because Lenin wants to get rid of what's irrational in Jacobinism. But he does want a similar kind of tightly knit party. And like you said, the French Revolution provides an example of revolutionary government, particularly under Robespierre. And there is also examples to emulate, obviously, and it becomes very clear in like 1905 and 1917, like who's playing what roles in the revolution, but also examples to avoid, because all of them don't want to have like a Napoleon figure. And in 1917, Napoleon actually goes uncast in terms of the actors. Like Kerensky kind of auditions for the role, the General Kornilov who tries a coup, but Napoleon isn't cast. And in the 20s, actually, it's feared that Trotsky would be this Napoleon figure, and his opponents used that to kind of unite against him. But he was more aware of that precedent than probably anyone, and he refused to play it. And interestingly, Stalin is aware of this as well. At one point, and it's kind of like one of these historical ironies, he doesn't want to have fratricidal violence in the party. He's like, if we start guillotining and shooting people, where will it end? Which is a good question, Joseph. You should have asked yourself that maybe 10 years later. But so everyone is wondering, are they going to follow the same path? So it does haunt them as well as inspire them, because they recognize that, obviously the French revolutions, the revolution of the bourgeoisie, and the Russian revolutions, that of the proletariat. So there is, understanding the differences, but also seeing like potential similarities in development.
I'm going to return to the question of Stalinism and this idea in a second, but since we're talking about antecedents and the views of the Russian revolutionaries towards those antecedents, can you tell me how they viewed the experience of 1871 and the Paris Commune, and how that experience was I guess you could say, embraced or incorporated by Lenin and the other revolutionaries into their understanding of the revolution still to come?
Sure. So obviously the Paris Commune in the Marxist tradition is seen as the first true example of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Abolishes the standing army, it has radical democracy, rule of the workers, etc. And the Bolsheviks and Lenin and Trotsky all embrace this example, particularly in 1917 when they see the Soviets as potentially forming a similar type of state. But also in the Marxist tradition, there's an understanding of the weaknesses of the commune, which did go down in a very bloody defeat. And these go back to Marx, who's like, you didn't seize the banks, which the Bolsheviks did do that. You didn't have an alliance with the peasantry. And obviously Lenin has the worker peasant alliance. And you really had a disorganized leadership that was not willing to take the initiative in the commune until it was too late. And in the Bolshevik Party is kind of like a way to have that kind of organization, that decisive leadership in the revolution. And they do succeed where the commune fails, because they are able to build a worker-peasant alliance and defend themselves against internal and external counter-revolutionaries. So they do see themselves as following in the footsteps of obviously the Commune and the French Revolution, but at a new higher stage.
Okay, so let me ask another very generic question that I think is important to ask at the outset here. Let's just define the word, Doug. What is Stalinism? This is, you think it's a straightforward question, but anybody who's ever debated this question knows it's much less straightforward than you might think. Depends on who's asking, depends on who's answering. So how do you respond to this question, Doug? What is Stalinism?
So simply put, Stalinism I define as a form of bureaucratic rule over collectivized property relations that were originally meant to foster Soviet proletarian democracy. And its ideology is that of socialism in one country and not proletarian internationalism. That's like my violently compressed formula. And also to add throughout the book, all these different figures who talk about Stalinism or communism, depending on who it is, they all have wildly very different definitions of it. But that's the version I use, and I try and actually define it very early in the book. Like, that's what it is. That's what I'm going by. And, we go from there.
Well, then let me ask as a follow-up question, why do you think there are so many different definitions of Stalinism? Why is this term so confused in its usage? Or maybe another way of saying it, why is it so dependent upon who's using the word?
That's a great question. And it really, since the Soviet Union represented itself as socialist and communist through, pretty much its whole existence, it depends. Like, some people look at it and say that's not an example of socialism, it's an example of Stalinism. This would be on Trotsky, Victor Serge, etc. But if you're an anti-communist, if you're one of these Cold War figures, say like a Richard Pipes, then you really actually don't use the word Stalinist all that much. You just see it as an example of communism. Because if you're suddenly distinguishing between, say, Leninism, Stalinism, Trotskyism, Maoism, or whatever, then you're potentially saying that there are non-Stalinist versions of communism, that there are communisms that are not totalitarian. And obviously in the anti-communist mindset, that is something you don't do. It's like it's a straight line. There's something written in the genetic code. And for the members of the communist parties, some obviously have and do use the term, but mostly they just see it as identical with communism. That's really existing socialism, as the phrase went at one point. So they actually would see it almost as a deviation, or Trotskyite or anti-communist if you're talking to members of the communist parties, because they wouldn't make those distinctions, or at least not all the time.
Right, and it seems like both the anti-communist perspective and the pro-Stalin perspective kind of see Stalinism as a necessary endpoint, as the final form of the revolution.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. In the anime, it's the final form, right? And for the anti-communists, it's like all communism is Stalinist. That's like its necessary flowering as totalitarianism, as godless reason, or whatever they want to call it. And for the Stalinists or the members of the communist parties, the only way to communism is through Stalinism. You have to have that phase, and anything that deviates from that is wrong. It's not socialist or communist. So even though they really were on opposite sides of the political barricades in many respects, they shared the same underlying teleological fatalism that this is it, that this is the inexorable destiny of communism. It's written in the stars. It's either a savior or a demon, depending on who you talk to, and no alternative is possible. It's either abstract, romantic, or it's a devil against the will of history. So they have that identity. That's to borrow from Mao, it's almost the unity of opposites here.
Well, you segued me nicely because I have to admit I'm fortunate enough to be friends with you on Facebook and to follow your work and your updates on the work that you do. So I happen to know that this book was not originally intended to be about Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn. This was originally intended to be sort of a project looking at Maoism and Maoist views on Stalinism. So how do we get from your initial project of looking at Maoism to this book, which is really not about Maoism at all?
Right. So there's originally back in 2020, 2021, I wanted to do a project on the Maoists looking at the Soviet experience, which I don't think gets as much attention as it deserves. Because there's so many figures there. We obviously all hear about all the different Trotskyist takes, and that's well and good, but I did want to look at the Maoists. And part of that project ended up in this one, which was on the Althusser chapter, has essentially been incorporated. But as things developed, I was going to work with my friend and comrade, who the book is dedicated to, Harrison Floss, on Domenico Lacerda, who had written his own book on Stalin called History and Critique of the Black Legend. We wanted to do like pretty much it's a critique deconstruction of it. But for various reasons, Harrison couldn't work on it. So as things developed, I realized, this book, to situate Lacerda, I had to look at like Western Marxists, the anti-communists and all this. And I realized this is a lot bigger than Domenico Lacerda. And it was actually a good way to start looking at Stalinism and, communism, etc., in a much broader canvas. And obviously the Lacerda stuff is still there. It's basically the long appendix, but it was inspired by that. And, Harrison offered wonderful feedback through every step of it. But it eventually evolved into looking at the Soviet Union and Stalinism and all these kind of debates. And, I'm very happy with how that came out, even if at some point I might want to go back and do Maoism on Stalinism. But that's how it.
Well, why don't you give us a very brief preview of that? So, in your research and your analysis, what are some of the ways that you would characterize how Maoists viewed the Stalinist legacy?
It's very interesting. I think it's an internal criticism, because if you read Mao himself and you look at the experience of Mao, there's like back and forth. He kind of comes to leadership of the Chinese party in opposition to the Soviet-backed leadership, and there's a give and take. At the same time, Mao is, supporting Stalin in the Soviet Union through the 40s and the early 50s, but he ignores their advice when he essentially takes power. And there's obviously, after the secret speech, it's interesting because Mao condemns the secret speech, but he clearly recognizes that there's problems of bureaucratization in the revolution, and he does want to kind of reform things, shake it up, and have a different path in China. And he eventually comes to the conclusion that the Soviet Union has restored capitalism after Stalin's death, and to prevent that, he has the Cultural Revolution. So part of my interest, my thesis is kind of like the Cultural Revolution is actually Mao's fully developed critique of Stalinism, whatever else you think about it. And within the Maoist camp, there's all kinds of different figures. There's like Orthodox Maoists who kind of uphold Mao, who's Stalin's 70% good, but 30% bad. You have people like Charles Bettelheim, who's a French theorist, and he actually says, well, the Soviet Union essentially restored capitalism under Stalin. And you have people like Samir Amin, Louis Althusser, and there's even a host of people who's like, Mao is so good that he actually rejects Bolshevism entirely and their whole economism. So there's some very interesting debates that I just don't think people are super aware of about like all the different Maoist camps. And it's worth paying attention to them because in the broader world, places like India or the Philippines or Nepal, they're actually a large force on the broad left. So it's actually kind of worth knowing what they're saying about all this.
And would it be fair to say that the views that you just described would also, I guess, sort of include the broad camp that you might call third worldism?
More or less, yeah. The third worldists are like there's a lot of overlap with the Maoists. The thing that distinguishes them is they basically just write off the working class in the first world countries of the US, UK, etc., as either non existent or permanently non revolutionary.
Let's take a quick break because on the other side of the break, what I would like to do is to connect some of these theoretical ideas that we've been discussing with some of the contemporary politics that we deal with today. Because fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, the question of Stalinism is relevant on the left today, especially in the sort of hyper extremely online left that many of us know and love, or hate. So let's talk about that on the other side of the break. We'll continue with Doug Greene. Make sure you get yourselves a copy of the book. Again, Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn, Anticommunism, Marxism, and the Fate of the Soviet Union. And if you can't get yourself a copy, push your local library, your local bookstore, what have you, to order copies, to make those available to people in your area. That would be great. That's a great way to support the book. And we'll continue the conversation with Doug Greene here on CounterPunch. We'll be right back. And we are back chatting with Doug Greene. We're talking about his brand new book, Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn, Anticommunism, Marxism, and the Fate of the Soviet Union. I feel really lucky to have this book sitting on my desk. It's so packed with information that unfortunately we don't have nearly the amount of time that we would need to really do it justice. So I want to just kind of jump around a little bit if we could, and just begin the second half of our conversation by asking another very general question. Why, Doug, do you think the question of Stalinism is even relevant to the left and to our debates today? Is it?
It is. Now, I've had people tell me, well, the Soviet Union collapsed 30 years ago. Stalin, Trotsky is even longer than that. But when you talk to someone, and I'm not going to assume some hardline anti-communist, but someone who means well is like, well, didn't all that end in gulags and terror? What if we try it again? And that's our fate. We're going to have, terror and all of this stuff. So whenever we talk about socialism and the possibility of a post-capitalist future, this question comes up: what's it going to look like? And I think we on the left should actually be able to answer that. That doesn't mean we have to own Stalin and those crimes, but it does mean we actually have to rationally and soberly explain them. And it comes up also because you have major states in the world that are still kind of claiming this lineage. China, the People's Republic of China is a good example. North Korea, and you have mass parties, which were formerly aligned with the Soviet Union in like South Africa, in India, in Portugal and Greece, that are claimed to be Marxist Leninists. So this debate, it still is relevant for large sections of the left in how they view socialism. And it's going to exist until hopefully we get past, we all have socialism and we don't have to debate Stalinism ad nauseum.
The book is full of a lot of characters. It's a wide cast of characters that stretches multiple centuries. It's names that you know, household names. It's names that you maybe don't know. So without, at the risk of just asking you to run down the index and define each and every person, which we don't have time to do, can you just highlight some of the major figures that you note in the book that had real important contributions to this question of Stalinism and the left in the 20th century? What are some of those figures, and what contributions did they make to this discourse?
Sure. To go very quickly, you have those who saw Stalinism as this Judeo-Bolshevik virus. That's not really a good contribution, but that's like Hitler, Churchill, actually Alexander Solzhenitsyn to a large extent. George Orwell, he saw Stalinism as the sadistic big brother with a penchant for cruelty. And you have also in what I call the counter Enlightenment, these are like the anti-communists from the Cold War, like Robert Conquest, Ernst Nolte, Francois Furet, Leszek Kolakowski, Jacob Talman. These are all people who are different aspects. They're attacking reason, and they see it as like the root of a Stalinist evil, and it kind of becomes it's fully formed in like the Black Book of Communism, which is their crowning jewel. And then you have obviously the debate on historical necessity between people like the German novelist Arthur Koestler and the French philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and all the major figures of Western Marxism are kind of like, do we support Stalinism? Do we oppose it? And there's kind of like variations in that, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse, Bertolt Brecht, Jean-Paul Sartre, who I think has one of the longest chapters in the book, Walter Benjamin, Gramsci, Lukács. So I look at them, and there's obviously Trotsky himself, who's a large portion of the book, and people who come out of the Trotskyist movement, like the novelist Victor Serge and the historian Isaac Deutscher, and of course Domenico Lucerdo is the appendix. There's a lot of other figures sprinkled in there, but those are just some of the people who are discussed, in these different camps. And just a point to add is I actually enjoyed writing all the sections. Even the visceral anti-communists, some of them were very talented writers, and it's actually a lot of fun as a writer to be able to bring them into a discussion on that.
Well, to that point, I mean, give us some examples of some of these figures that, if you were interested in reading anti-communist perspectives on Stalin, what that you would recommend for leftists.
Who I really actually enjoyed it is Arthur Koestler's work. He was originally a member of the German Party, and he turned against it. And he wrote a novel which kind of dramatizes the whole debate on historical necessity called Darkness at Noon, which is about a member of the Bolshevik Party who confesses to crimes that he didn't commit. He knows he doesn't commit, but he does it because he thinks it will serve the cause. And if you want, it's a very short novel. I don't think it's more than 200 pages, but it's actually incredibly well written, and it really gets at those debates. So he's actually someone I really would recommend people to read if you're interested in like an anti-communist perspective. Someone else that might actually be kind of interesting, just because he's kind of got a very flowery language, and I don't agree with him at all, but it's entertaining to read, is Richard Pipes's work on the Russian Revolution, even if he's like pretty much a czarist and everything, but he's got this Dostoevsky type feel to his writing, which is very entertaining to read. So you can kind of get like his overview. And the other person is actually Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Whatever else I can say about him, he's actually a very talented writer. He's actually, it's, even if some of the stuff he described is like pretty horrid, it's, he's actually enjoyable to read on that type of level.
I wonder, just occurred to me, did you do any reading in preparation for the book and in researching for the book? Did you do any reading from some of the academic types that made their way into imperialist policy circles? Say, for instance, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Henry Kissinger, people like this, because I know they also have long histories of their views of Stalinism.
Well, I didn't really talk about, I actually did use Brzezinski when I was talking about totalitarianism. I didn't really use Kissinger, but a lot of the other people I did were involved in policy. So Richard Pipes he was involved in these high-level, he was like an administrator at Harvard at their Russian studies. He was involved in the Nixon administration and in the Reagan administration, making policy in terms of places like Central America, etc. Robert Conquest was involved with British intelligence. I believe he was a speechwriter for Thatcher, and he actually had the ear of Alexander Haig, who was involved with the Reagan administration. So a lot of the anti-communists I was talking about were heavily involved in, various levels of, policy making. So it wasn't just an academic exercise for them. I didn't really get into Kissinger itself, but a lot of the others, were involved. And one thing just to add is when the Cold War starts, there's a purging of academia, and Russian studies is essentially created by business and the government to study the Soviet Union as its new enemy. So a lot of this stuff is incredibly tied into a lot of funding, which kind of show. And it's, if you actually, if you actually have any knowledge of Marxism or the Soviet Union, you can realize like how laughable their understanding is. But that was, for a long time, that was the only game in town, because all these academics were tied into the State Department, intelligence agencies, etc.
And what about our departed friend Stephen Cohen, whose book on Bukharin was such a splash in the Soviet Union in the late 70s and the early 80s? Bukharin and the sort of revival of Bukharin cast the Stalin legacy in yet a new light by the 1980s and the period of perestroika. What about Stephen Cohen and his contributions in the realm of Bukharin?
Cohen is a fascinating figure because he's not a Marxist at all. He's pretty much a liberal, I believe, in terms of his politics. But he's part of this diffuse current that's not really unified that I call the revisionists. And they're basically challenging a lot of the Cold War stereotypes that the Soviet Union is this, godless tyranny bent on totalitarian domination. And he's pretty much resurrecting Bukharin as saying, like, listen, the Bolsheviks were actually like, they had lively debates in them. When Stalin came, he was essentially this break from Bolshevism and communism. And obviously he's defending Bukharin's alternative, which I don't, but I understand why he's doing it. And Cohen is, interestingly, he was friends with the late Mikhail Gorbachev, and supposedly Gorbachev decided to rehabilitate Bukharin after reading Cohen's book. So Cohen himself, I think a lot of his contributions are actually on Soviet history, actually really still worth reading. They're very good. And there's others in that school, people like Robert Tucker, Sheila Fitzpatrick, J.R. Getty, who you don't have to agree with everything they say, but I really think their work on the Soviet Union, a lot of it really demolishes a lot of the Cold War stereotypes, and it just gives you a much fuller picture. And Cohen is, in the vanguard of that, and just very valuable to read.
I want to switch gears the final portion of our conversation and talk about, I don't know, what do we call it? Neo-Stalinism, the new Stalinism, the Stalinism that you might encounter these days, because for the most part, I don't think people are dealing in the kind of bureaucratic structures that we might associate with historical Stalinism. I don't know that there's very much opportunity for that sort of thing, especially for those of us living in Western countries. But there is a thing called Stalinism that exists, and it's I would say, mostly online phenomenon. Can you explain how you would describe 21st century Stalinism?
I kind of watch so there, to put it like this, a lot of people, when they come to the left, they realize, the capitalists have lied to us about everything, which is true. And they look at like, what's like something they hate, and they look, oh, Stalin or North Korea or whatever. And they're like, you know what, they just do the opposite thing. Well, they're lying to us. So everything they said about this was false. So we're just going to embrace this very uncritically. And on the one hand, you do have organizations, like the PSL or et cetera, who kind of, have that kind of view on a lot of that history. But a lot of this is, again, I think there's a lot of young people who are looking for alternatives, and that's what they embrace. It's really a big drop from, say, the debates of Jean-Paul Sartre or Bertolt Brecht. Whatever else you say about them, those were serious intellectuals engaged with mass parties and real questions. A lot of these people, I don't think, are very serious. They don't do a lot of reading. And it's one thing to say the capitalists lie to you, but to then just say like Stalin did nothing wrong, which is a meme a lot of them use, it's not in a Marxist spirit, a scientific spirit. It's like, Stalin did a lot of things wrong, and Stalinism is not going to actually get you to communism. And it's actually worth, doing a scientific investigation. But I think for the online Stalinists, and a lot of them have like just like repulsive politics, you have like, a lot of these people embrace anti-Semitism and a lot of conspiracy theories. And it becomes a signifier, because I think for a lot of them also, they just like the idea of like this big, strong, tough, authoritarian guy who's brutalizing people and is opposed to America and embracing traditional values, etc. So it's really grotesque in a lot of respects. And, the people, if you watch them online, they're jokes. They're really jokes. I'm not going to give any names because I don't really want to give too much credibility to these people, but people in the know who we're talking about. These people are clowns, and they're like I said, they're a far leap behind like people like Brecht or Marcuse or whoever else was engaged in these debates at the high point.
I mean, to put it into the most nauseating of political terms today, I would say that the quote unquote leftists who embrace Stalin, what they're really embracing is an anti-woke communist, right? I mean, they're essentially, it's like an embrace of anti-woke politics from the left, because they see all of, Stalin's communist ideas as good, but also Stalin as sort of the crusader, well, as you say, crusader against the West, but also they're pretty okay with Stalin's extremely reactionary, conservative policies that were implemented in the Soviet Union themselves. I mean, we have to, of course, point out that Stalin reintroduced laws against homosexuality, against abortion, all of these sort of extremely sort of revolutionary and radical policies that the Bolsheviks had implemented. Stalin rolled back as he reintroduced a kind of great Russian chauvinism, as Lenin called it. And it should be pointed out that those sections of the quote unquote online left that are embracing Stalin today, they embrace a lot of that chauvinistic attitude.
Yeah, the online left you're talking about definitely does, and that kind of it flows like everything from reinstituting the traditional family against homosexuality, abortion, and cultural experimentation, and internationalism was all of that Stalin kind of repudiated. It flows from socialism in one country taken to its logical conclusion. The fact that Russia's or the Soviet Union's what they call World War II is the Great Patriotic War is actually kind of disturbing if you think about it, considering the Soviet Union was a multi-ethnic country. And, part of the war effort meant a privileging of great Russians and also the deportation of various nationalities, etc. And, it gets very grotesque at the end of Stalin's life with things like the anti-cosmopolitan campaign and the Doctor's Plot, which are not so veiled anti-Semitism in a lot of places. So a lot of these, if you talk to a lot of these online Stalinists, when they talk about Trotsky, it's like they don't like this idea of like a rootless cosmopolitan and internationalist. It becomes pretty anti-Semitic, I think, in how they view it. And I think to embrace, to reject internationalism is to reject communism. If we're universalists, it's communism's for everybody, essentially, or at least for all the working class. And if you have like this, and for from the Leninist and the Bolshevik tradition, we're tribunes of the people. We fight for all the oppressed and exploited. We actually do care about anti-trans and being anti-racist and all of this, fighting these anti-trans legislation or whatever. Like, you can't be a communist if you think like homosexuality is a bourgeois decadence or something. But a lot of these people, like you say, embrace it, and that's damaging. We shouldn't want to be associated with that. That's part of the legacy we reject.
And I think real communists in the real spirit of communism recognize the very checkered history that the communist movement has with regard to LGBT questions and some of the things that you mentioned. And it's part of what I think defines 21st century socialists, communists, Marxists as having that view and understanding that our own historical tradition is not squeaky clean on those questions.
Oh, yeah. The official communist movement had a very checkered history, but even splits from it, whether the Maoists or the Trotskys, did not have the best records. I think a lot of groups are much better today, honestly, and that's very good. But it is part of the history, and it's worth taking an account of. It's not something we should want to uphold uncritically because it's bad history. We should actually celebrate what the Bolsheviks did in repudiating czarist laws against homosexuality and making abortion, free in demand for all and all of that kind of stuff. It may not be like the end point, but it's certainly like a beginning to build on. That's the legacy that we definitely should embrace. Because if we're serious about communism and liberation, that means it has to be liberation for gay people, for women, etc. They can't be left out. And these anti-woke people, these anti-woke Stalinists, whatever else you call them, it's like they want to leave them out, and it's just a very unappealing vision. It's almost fascistic in certain variants of them.
You once said, I know you've said it before, that you could tell what kind of a communist a person is based on the year that they think the revolution ended, which I think is very hilarious and correct. And for me, I certainly know where I think it ends. And I think that to some degree, now this is an oversimplification, of course, but to some degree, Stalinism puts an end to the revolution. And specifically for me, even before I read Marx, even before I read Lenin, even before I embraced Marxism as an ideology for myself, I was studying Soviet avant-garde art and the art movements of the late teens and then to the 1920s. And Stalin really is the hard stop on the flowering of the arts in the 1920s, the liquidation of the arts coming in 1930. And so, in a sense, Stalinism, aside from its political meaning and political content and political character, Stalinism in some ways is the symbolic end of the true revolutionary avant-garde of the early revolutionary period.
That's definitely true. If you watch like the Eisenstein films of the 20s and then later, they're very different, I think. And obviously all Eisenstein films are worth watching, but there's a different political content. And like when you have like, the Soviet posters of like the earlier period and you compare them later with the socialist realism, it's not quite the same thing. And it's much more tightly controlled, and, it's really sapping out a lot of creativity. The thing I would just add is that by the time, the 30s and the Great Purges, there's pretty much Stalin's autocratic rule and dictatorship is like fully formed at that point. And the working class really is so disorganized and dispersed by Stalinism that it's really not able to fight the final counter-revolution, the restoration of capitalism under Gorbachev, when they fully go back to the free market, etc. Even if like was still a planned economy, which I think was worth defending, etc. But the working class was essentially shut out of political life under Stalinism. And, that's something that if you're a Marxist, Leninist, or Stalinist, like you got to actually explain how that's like conductive to working class rule and advancing towards socialism. Because I think Trotsky was right that sooner or later, the bureaucratic leaders of the Soviet Union were going to restore capitalism without, workers, rising up and taking power again.
In some ways, Stalinism to me represents the end of everything that really was inspiring in the Bolshevik movement and in the Russian Revolution. And it kind of, I know many have used this word. I'm not the first to use it, but it's sort of the way in which the revolution became ossified.
Yeah, it becomes ossified, frozen. I've sometimes used the phrase zombie Marxism, which is one way to use it. Because even if you support, which I think, the Soviet Union defeating Nazi Germany was a good thing, but a lot of like specific policies about how that was done in terms of promoting nationalism, the behavior of the Red Army as they moved into Germany, a lot of that's very repulsive. And it's not how I would imagine a Red Army should behave. And you have also internationally, like a lot of dedicated activists at various communist parties who are joining, I think for the best of reasons, but they convince themselves of this historical necessity and they compromise themselves incredibly. Like Brecht is one of the great artists of the 20th century, but if you read his rationale and apologeta for Stalin and how he's trying to make sense of it, it's really tortured. It's like, his moral compass kind of gets spun all around, and he's just like emblematic of what was experienced by tens of thousands, if not more people. And I think, part of the reason to embrace like Trotsky and that legacy is it embraces the Bolshevism that stayed true to the cause, that was willing to fight for it, against both Western imperialism, but also against Stalinist deformation, and still held aloft that red banner of internationalism and Soviet power, which I still think is the alternative to capitalism. It's not like a new bureaucracy. It should, if we're fighting for communism, we have to fight for, working class rule, etc.
Return to this question of young people online embracing Stalin. It's so it's sad, it's embarrassing, but I think it's also kind of illuminating, because Stalin to me is in many ways is the dregs of our tradition. It's embracing the worst elements of our own tradition. And so I'm sort of stuck with this question of what does what drives this? What motivates embracing Stalin of all figures? Not Lenin, not Bolshevism, but Stalin himself specifically. Is this a lack of organization on the left? Is this a lack of understanding? Is this a failure of the left to organize? Is this just the nature of online discourse and the way that the algorithms promote this sort of extreme polarization and trolling and, all of the rest of these online sort of behaviors that we know? What explains this sort of resurgence of Stalinist apologia?
Partly it's the diffuse nature. There's all kinds of reasons that are apparent to it, but one is, since socialism has become sort of it's no longer like this complete taboo term in the last 10 or 15 years, then everyone can kind of like claim it. So on the one hand, you have like the Social Democrats, the Democratic Socialists, but a lot of people look at that and see them, well, they're supporting the Democrats and imperialism, so that's really not what socialism is. So they're looking for something more hard line. And they see Stalin as, well, this is this reviled figure, but he's actually like really cool, etc. And so partly the nature of online discourse is not super conductive to the type of intellectual debate I think historically the left has been associated with, and the algorithms are there. And unfortunately, if you look at like a lot of like these streamers or YouTube channels who are like promoting this anti-woke Stalinism, it's basically like a quote unquote a Marxist Jerry Springer style. Like it's devoid of actually intelligent thought. And I do think it's sad that like what I would consider a genuine communist alternative just really hasn't cohered in the US in a type of an organized form. And unfortunately, people gravitate towards what's out there, and there's not this clear pull of attraction. Like, one of the good things about 1956 and the Khrushchev revelations is it really actually opened the field up on the left. Suddenly the Communist Party hegemony was not what it was, and different ideas could be expressed, and there was all this possibility. And we don't really have that so much now, just because and it's also, I think, just a lowered horizons of people. Like when people were looking to, say, China and Vietnam in the 60s, whatever else you can say about them, it's a little different than looking to it now. I can definitely see why China in those earlier periods, and certainly Vietnam, was very inspiring. But now you have them instituting market reforms and, building the productive forces and everything. And, people say like, oh, that's what we're looking to. This is great. And it's like, this is a very uninspiring vision. And I think, looking to Stalin is part of a very uninspiring vision of the future. And I do think, you can blame those people all you want, but, it is incumbent upon like what, genuine Marxists and communists that we actually have not been successful in building a robust alternative. So that's the thing we actually do need to rectify, hopefully in the near future.
And I think also one important aspect that I would ask you to comment on also is that this book, which in many ways it deals really in the tradition of communism, but it illuminates a lot more than just Stalin and communism. And so my question to you would be, with an eye towards those who might be listening or watching us who are not communists, maybe even some who describe themselves as being sympathetic to Marx, but tending more towards anarchism. What is there for those non-communists of the left to learn from the book and from Stalinism?
I think there's a number of things that they can learn from the book. Is first, what were a lot of these major debates on the Soviet Union and Stalinism, from both the right, the left, the anti-Stalinist left, etc. But there's also debates on how we envision rebellions. Like, do rebellions, what is the legacy of the French Revolution? What role does philosophy play? Because for a lot of the anti-communists, they see the root of Stalinism in rationality, in enlightenment, and this idea of like that the world can be rationally organized. And that's something that affects all the left. It wasn't just directed against the Stalinists. The other thing is, for those who are sympathetic to Marx and think like, well, all Marxists are a bunch of authoritarian statists, etc., who just want to kill everybody. It's like, there's been a robust debate on the left about all this. And there's also debate on how this affects culture, on the type of society we envision. So I think, the book gets into, like, again, a lot of these wider debates on Stalinism and communism, but also it touches on issues of philosophy, on Hegel, on the Enlightenment and reason, on culture, on, what this means for, how we view fascism, how we view bourgeois democracy, all this. So there is, like, all these related questions to it, and just how we can kind of rescue or revive a Marxist tradition that I think, critical readers would appreciate, who, are not just like going to looking for shock value, because I'm sorry, the book is not for shock value.
Yeah, and one of the other things about it that I think is important is that Stalin looms so large over so many events of the 20th century. I mean, how do you understand, in the true sense of the word, how do you understand what the Spanish Civil War was all about if you don't know Stalin and what Stalin did, and how the sort of Stalinist view impacted the Civil War in Spain, or conversely, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and how the nature of European security, quote unquote, was forged in an alliance between Stalin and Hitler, and all of these things. In other words, digging into Stalin and understanding Stalinism allows you, I think, to have a better view of a lot of these key events of the 20th century, which fortunately or unfortunately, are still shaping a lot of politics today. I mean, if you follow the war in Ukraine, a lot of the positions, a lot of the perspectives of people in Eastern Europe are rooted in much of this historical experience.
Sure. And if you look at American politics, I believe the state of Florida just said, like, socialists are not welcome here. And that's also coming out of a long history of American anti-communism, which is still very much alive in both the Republican and Democratic parties. And I believe the House or the Senate, one of them, just passed a resolution condemning socialism and communism within the last year. So, there is, like, the Soviet Union was a state that existed for about 74 years. It obviously affected everyone there, but pretty much everyone around the world in some way or another was affected by this experience, for good or for ill. And, if you take the Spanish Civil War, there are elements of, inspiration in that, in the terms of the social revolution that occurred, the international brigades. I had, like, one of my distant relatives fought in Spain. But there are obviously, like, some very grotesque things there, like, the purging of the anarchists in the POUM by, like, the Spanish state with Soviet support, to curtail the revolution. So a lot of that's also mixed in together, things we might celebrate, but things we definitely would condemn. And it affected, people like Arthur Koestler and George Orwell were both involved in the Spanish Civil War, and that drastically shaped their worldviews on how they viewed things. And it is important to make an accounting of this experience. And hopefully my book goes some way to, it may not be the final word, but I hope it's an important word in providing a critical Marxist perspective on how we view some of these debates, on how we understand them. Because if we're to have a revival of socialism and communism, which I do think we need, it's a material necessity, we do need to have our own accounting of Stalinism, etc., and to envision a communism that is hopefully non-Stalinist and anti-Stalinist for the future.
And I think also a sober assessment of Stalin allows us to place some of those events into their proper historical context, right? If you see Stalin as, just an, bolt from the blue, a monster, out of nowhere, well, then you can see the monster orchestrating the Holodomor as a genocide to wipe out all Ukrainians and to wipe them from the planet. But if you view Stalinism in a little bit more of a, in its more material reality, then you can understand, why there has been so much debate over the question of Holodomor and why it's been revised and re-revised, and why Tim Snyder and Robert Conquest have had to back off of some of their assertions about Holodomor after more research has come out. And so the discourse is alive, the scholarship is alive, and understanding Stalin and understanding that history, all of those events, whether Holodomor or the forced deportation of the Tatars or the forced deportation of the Koreans or whatever it might be, the Katyn massacre or Spain or any other example that you might think of, understanding Stalin allows you to contextualize these events in the 20th century and how they relate to what we're talking about today.
It does. And part of the book's argument is to reject the whole idea of like angels and demons, to, borrow from Dan Brown, I guess, is if you view Stalin as a demon, out of the blue, it's so overwhelming that you can't rationally comprehend it, which is, I think, the anti-communists, their fatal conceit is they don't want to embrace reason. They don't want to embrace a materialist worldview. It's all about moralism and mysticism for them. And in a different way, that's the case with the advocates of historical necessity. If you see Stalin as the savior and anyone who stands against him is against the will of history, the working class, then it's very easy to see Trotsky as like a Judas, and to see anyone who's opposed to Stalin on the left as some kind of criminal conspiracy of wreckers. And that really also doesn't explain anything. If you're suddenly going to justify every action as historically necessary, you're going to defend a lot of repulsive stuff. And if you can reject those twin positions and embrace a rational, materialist Weltanschauung, and look at this stuff without those blinkers, I think you come to a much clearer understanding. Like, not to get too much into the Ukraine and the famine there, but a lot of the online Stalinists, they have like very cartoonish views of this. But if you look at the serious scholarship that against people like Robert Conquest, and almost none of these people would call themselves Marxist, but they're rejecting his views as like asinine and just not based in fact, and like very faulty methodology. Like, there's clearly Soviet agricultural failures and crimes committed there, but this idea that it was like part of some internal genocidal project from the get-go is just really not supported. Even if we shouldn't really defend a lot of the Soviet agricultural policies.
But that's really about, Doug, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that's really about trying to shoehorn the idea that Stalin is equivalent to Hitler, isn't it? Hitler had his genocidal plans to eradicate Jews and Roma and disabled people and gay people and so forth. And then in order to justify the idea that Stalin is equivalent to Hitler, we have Stalin with his genocide of Holodomor, his attacks on, the Tatars and so forth, right? This, not to say that one crime is necessarily, lesser, quote unquote. Well, it is, but whatever. The point being that, the idea being to try to create an equivalence in order to justify what is a very dominant liberal view of 20th century history. I think Tim Snyder is probably the best example of, this. Tim Snyder's Bloodlands is a perfect example, right? That Eastern Europe is caught between the two demons, the two genocidal demons, right? Stalin and Hitler, and that they together, essentially in concert, create the bloodletting that is, Eastern Europe in the middle of the 20th century.
Yes, most definitely Snyder is a representative of that. And it obviously comes out of like liberal views of, the Soviet Union and totalitarianism, but it has like neo-Nazi roots as well. Someone like Ernst Nolte, who was a West German scholar, he basically, he ignited this firestorm in Germany when he basically said, like, we should treat Nazi Germany as like any other period of history, because it's really those dirty communists who started everything with their bloodlust. And, Hitler was just a reaction to that. And this became outright apologeta. Basically he came to the conclusion that, the invasion of the Soviet Union was a defensive response by the Third Reich against this greater totalitarianism of the Soviet Union, which also became both denying the Holocaust but justifying it happening. That's like very, this is this is a very extreme anti-communism, and people like Snyder are maybe not as extreme as Nolte, but they're coming out of that similar camp. And someone like Robert Conquest is as well, if you look at his writings on this. It's also, again, it's not an accident that this man was involved with like various intelligence services, which is certainly coloring his view. And if you have that view of the Soviet Union and communism as this genocidal enterprise, then you're embracing the view of you get to a point. Well, we're not, like, if you're viewing the communists as the greater evil, it gets to this point. Do you think the Nazis were victims of communism? Do you think the French resistance, a lot of whom were Communist Party members, were equivalent to the Wehrmacht occupying France, which actually was a live question at one point at a trial in France? And I think if you also embrace that view, you effectively shut out any chance or any way to rationally conceive a different world, because it all ends in this bloody, tyrannical, totalitarian hell. And I don't think it's supported by the evidence. And it's an ideological weapon against communism and Marxism in general that we do need to reject very forcefully.
I think also one of the reasons for this, and I know we're already over the time, but we're going to finish up here in a second, but one of the reasons for this too, and the phenomenon that I'm describing, is sort of this embrace of an actually, what really is a far right view of history that has actually been embraced by many that you might call center liberal types, Tim Snyder being an example of that, is that, Tim Snyder himself doesn't create this history out of nowhere, right? The people that inherited political power in places like the Baltics, for example, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, quite literally are the sons of the Nazi collaborators, right? So as they sort of restored their own political power, I'm thinking of like Landsbergis, for example, in Lithuania. I mean, they quite literally are that continuity from their parents' generation of collaborating with the Nazis. So for them, it is very much self-serving. They need to create this idea that Stalin and the Soviet Union were the true evil, that they were somehow equivalent to the Nazis, because it not only justifies their politics, it vindicates their own ancestors.
Right. And that's partly, Nolte in Germany came out of a society that did not purge the Nazis, that they were in very high levels of government. And this was in contrast to East Germany, which at least purged a lot of them. And after, the restoration of capitalism in Eastern Europe, you certainly do have like a lot of like this resurgence of the far right and nationalism. Partly this is, there is like also the revulsion of, that experience, but you don't want to revive like Nazi collaborators who were involved in like the Holocaust in wherever the Baltics or wherever else. And it is serving as this legitimacy, for those kind of politics that, we should not, after the experience of World War II and the Holocaust, we should not ever want to revive, and we have to combat them wherever they are.
I'm sorry, Doug. No, none of them were Nazi collaborators. They were only nationalists. They just wanted freedom for their people. Not a single one of them collaborated with Nazis. Never.
My mistake. I take it back, all of it back.
Well, that is how it is presented. Of course, Ukraine is the most obvious example where we see this history alive in the politics today. But it is true throughout all of Eastern Europe. It is caricatured by many, pro Putin types today to make it into whatever caricature is fitting for their purposes. It's also caricatured by pro Western types. So we have a continuing sort of contestation of that history. And I think many of us of the Marxist left, of the non-Stalinist Marxist left, find ourselves desperately trying to right the historical, sort of wrongs in the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it was fairly recently I saw a post. It was from either Lithuania or Latvia. It was somewhere in the Baltics, and they were saying, we're honoring these fighters against Soviet communism. They may have worn the SS uniform, but they really weren't fighting for Nazi Germany. Like, yeah, sure, right, and all of that. So, and you're right, obviously in Ukraine, it's an issue. And the fact, Putin and his crew are those who inherited, like, they basically benefited from the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they're visceral anti-communists, etc. And it informs also debates, a lot of the current ideological makeup of the American right. comes out of these anti-communist debates of earlier periods. And it's incumbent upon us of the Marxist left. For one, it's not about defending Stalinism. It's about correcting the historical record. And that's always worth doing, because I do think, it's a cliche, I do think the truth is on our side. And it is worth pointing out the absurdity of like right-wing claims on the Soviet Union, etc. And because whatever our criticisms of Stalin are as Marxists, they are not they should not be conflated with those of the right. And we do need to keep our alternative alive. And that means, again, rejecting those claims. And again, of course, rejecting the claims of the Stalinists that it was all for the greater good, etc. But if we can, so the left, I think, has the dual task of not only refuting like that lingering Stalin nostalgia that may exist, but also refuting the claims of anti-communism, because anti-communism is not about attacking Stalin, or not solely. It's about an ideological weapon to attack all ideas of changing the world for socialism and communism, whatever banner they wave, whether it's anarchism, Trotskyism, or whatever. And therefore, it is actually incumbent upon us to refute their lies. Because again, I do think the truth is on our side.
And of course, also, it almost doesn't need to be said, and yet here I am going to explicitly state it. Anti-communism is the base. It is the door, the springboard into pretty much all fascist politics. The fascist politics of the far right, whether it's online conspiracy politics, whether it's actual neo-Nazi politics, or anything in between, the far right is rooted. Its ideological sort of lodestar is anti-communism and anti-Semitism, and you find it in every conceivable form on the far right. So when we understand, that we're up against a rising fascist movement in the United States and in Europe, we see in that fascist movement, whether it's DeSantis or Trump or whomever, everyone's a commie. Everyone's a communist. Anything to the left of Genghis Khan is communism, right? Because anti-communism is in the DNA of fascist politics.
Yeah, pretty much. Marx and Engels said it in the Communist Manifesto, where is the party in opposition that's not been branded as communistic? And every fascist movement, whether in Spain, Italy, in America today, in France, they have that. It's a part of their baseline. It may not always be the most prominent thing. They may be focusing on something else, but when they attack elites, they're not attacking elites because they're oppressing people or exploiting people. They're attacking them because they see them as, insidious Jews or foreign globalists who are exploiting our people, which is this very nationalist and reactionary agenda. It's a false alternative that they pose. And they when the fascists call themselves the third way, it's meant to distinguish themselves from the communists and the capitalists, but ultimately they fall into supporting the bourgeoisie every single time. It's a false systematic alternative. And, part of a revival of communist politics, I think, is making communism that specter that these people fear as a credible alternative, so that people don't get swept up into this, because anti-communism is the foundation, an opposition to reason, to universalism, to all of this is part and parcel of the far right. And one thing I hope people take away from my book is all the people who formed this Cold War counter-enlightenment, they saw the idea of reason and enlightenment as this original sin of communism. And I think it's actually incumbent upon the left to be yes, reason is part of the origin of communism, and we're actually going to defend it and uphold it, because we do believe that people have it within their capability to change the world and make it, fit for everybody to realize their full human potentiality. So.
Absolutely. That's very beautifully said. We will leave it there. Doug Greene has been my guest today. The book, again, Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn, Anticommunism, Marxism, and the Fate of the Soviet Union. There's the really cool looking cover. I would recommend you get yourselves a copy. If you can't get yourself a copy, then you can also go to your public library and harass them endlessly to get multiple copies into the library so that many people can read this book. Doug Greene, as always, thank you for coming on CounterPunch and chatting with us. Always appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Great time.
Listeners, viewers, as always, thank you again for the continued support, and we will chat with you again very, very soon.